All right, so we are going to move on to the next category of business rule, which is to do dependently required fields. So this is when you want to define some logic so that fields are required some of the time, but they're not required all of the time. If you want a field to be always required, you would define that in the field properties instead of using a business rule. So that's obviously simpler. It's just always required. And the always required logic is enforced through the API and through doing imports and things like that. Whereas, again, as Chris mentioned, business rules are only applied when you're using the page in Creatio, so not if you're doing a data import or using the API to add that data. So that's one important difference between these two different ways of requiring fields, besides obviously the difference of always versus sometimes. All right, so we're going to do a couple of examples here. I'm actually going to do them in the opposite of the order I listed them here, but we're going to start with going back to that reason lost field. And in addition to showing it when the opportunity is lost, we're now going to make it required when the opportunity is lost. And then we're going to put some logic in on the context page to have some sort of complex requirements there. We either want the phone number or the email to be required. And in particular, we don't really care if it's the business phone or the mobile phone. So we want to make sure at least one of those three fields is filled in for every contact, but we don't really care which one it is. So if I jump back over to Creatio, we're going to go back into our opportunities section and go back into our page designer. And go over to our business rules. And again, we want to add another business rule related to the reason for closing, but it's a distinct action. So it's going to need to be an additional business rule, just like we saw with the multiple business rules for type equals customer. And so same idea, we're going to have our logic in here of stage equals close lost. But this time, instead of picking show element on the page as our action, we're going to make a field required. And it's going to ask us which field we want to make required. And we'll go ahead and pick our reason for closing field. And apply and go through the save process. And once we do that, that field will not only pop up on the screen when we close the opportunity as closed lost, but it will also then be required for us to fill that in. Okay, so again, pre-business rule, that field is not required, but post-business rule, it will be. And it is important to just to recognize that I could not use the always required field property in this scenario because I wouldn't want this field to be required at times when it's hidden, because it will try to force the user to fill that field in, even though it's been hidden and not displayed on the screen. So if you have fields that are show hide business rules, have fields that have a show hide business rule on them, you would not want that field to always be required, because that's going to be a conflict in your settings. You'd want to make sure that your required rules are at least as restrictive, if not more restrictive, than your show hide rules. So I could have this be required only for closed lost and some specific type of opportunity if it didn't apply to all my opportunities, but I wouldn't want it to be required in situations where I don't have closed lost as a condition. And you can see now that this field is required. It would make me fill that field in order to make any changes here. We'll just fill something else out really quick so we get the save button to pop up, and it does the usual required field error to make me fill that field in. All right, and then the other example we're going to do here, again, is that contact example where we want the mobile phone or the business phone or the email to be required. I've actually done a little bit of the work here already just to save a little time, but we're going to add a business rule on the email address. So we're going to set the logic for when the email field should be required. This is going to give us a chance to have some slightly more complex logic than the ones we did before with our if conditions here. So our email field should be required if the business phone is not filled in, and the mobile phone is not filled in. So if both of those are empty, then we want email to be required. And by the way, while I'm thinking about it, if you needed or logic here for some reason, we don't in this example, but if we did, you would just click on the and to change it to an or. So this scenario that we're doing here, again, requires multiple business rules. So this one is when the email should be required. We should also have one, it looks like I made a minor mistake here. We should also have one for when the business phone is required, which would be when mobile phone and email are both not filled in. And then finally, this one should be the mobile phone. Apparently I did the same thing twice here. The mobile phone should be required if the business phone and the email are not filled in. So 3 variations of the same thing, applying logic to all 3 of those fields that are included in our requirement here. Save that change. And what this one is going to look like is it's going to show all 3 of those fields as required until we fill one of them in. Once we have one filled in, all 3 of them will no longer show as required because we've met the conditions of those 3 rules at that point. Okay. So refresh my page. And here I've got my 3 fields, my mobile phone, my business phone, my email. It's hard to even see on the email because it's kind of under that label, but it is actually required. We can tell from the enter a value label here. If I fill in any one of these 3 fields, again, that satisfies the condition. So the other 2 are no longer required. If I filled in a different one instead, oops, if I can highlight what I want here, now they all go back to being required again. Let's just put in an email address. Again, same thing happens. We've now met the condition of having at least one of those 3 filled in. So again, the requirement goes away from all 3 of them.